Hello, and welcome back to the Crime Reel. For this week's true crime narration, we shall be looking at the life and crimes of Andrew Mallard. Andrew was born in England on August the 16th, 1962, and emigrated to Australia with his family when he was 5. When looking at Andrew's early life, he seemed a troubled sort of kid and perhaps an easy target. He was very tall for his age and was bullied throughout his time in school, leading to him dropping out at the age of 16. As an adult, he spent 8 months in the army before being medically discharged. After that, he moved around a great deal, including overseas and back again, and drifted from one temporary job to the next. By May 1994, 32-year-old Andrew seemed to be struggling. He wound up in Perth, Australia, where he was mostly couch surfing and using marijuana. To supplement the social security payments he was receiving, he relied on his skills as a con artist and petty thief. There were multiple minor convictions on his record, all of which were for non-violent offences such as traffic violations and stealing. On the 23rd of May 1994, Andrew was arrested in connection with a burglary that he had committed the previous afternoon. In just a few hours, he was charged and then released on bail. Around the same time that Andrew was arranging to have a taxi take him back to where he was staying in Mosman Park, an employee at a nearby jewellery store called Flora Metallica was finishing up her shift, leaving the owner of the establishment, 45-year-old Pamela Lawrence, to run the shop by herself. A short time later, Pamela would be the victim of a brutal attack. At around 6:15 p.m. that evening, Pamela's husband realised that she had not arrived home from work. After attempting to call and getting no answer at the shop, he went to investigate and found her on the floor, barely alive, after a vicious attack to the head. She was rushed to the hospital, but sadly died in the ambulance. At the crime scene, the authorities were puzzled by what appeared to be a random act of violence with no motive to speak of. Despite being surrounded by jewellery, nothing appeared to have been taken from the displays. Pamela's handbag was still there, although it appeared that a wallet containing a small amount of money was missing. This was especially odd because there was a container of cash located in plain view behind the counter, but that remained untouched. If someone had harmed Mrs. Lawrence during the course of a robbery, it didn't make sense for them to leave behind such an easily accessible stash of money in favour of a purse they probably had to search to find. The blood spatter found at the shop suggested that she was first attacked in the front of the establishment and then dragged to the rear. Then she suffered multiple blows to the skull before being left for dead. During her autopsy, the coroner found massive blunt force trauma from a weapon that couldn't readily be identified by the shape of her wounds. What could be identified, though, were flecks of blue paint left from whatever she'd been attacked with. As the investigation continued, a potential witness was discovered. A 13-year-old daughter of a shop employee was driving past Flora Metallica with her grandmother at around 5 p.m. on the day of the murder. The young girl noticed a strange man standing behind the counter in the store. When this stranger realised that he had been seen, he quickly ducked down, but not before the young girl could make out a few specific details, such as his ginger beard and bandana. On the 24th of May, the day after Pamela's murder, Andrew Mallard once again found himself in custody, this time for impersonating a police officer. After being charged with the crime, he was sent to a local hospital for psychiatric assessment. With Andrew's face still fresh in the minds of the police, they quickly considered him as a suspect in Pamela's attack. While in the hospital, he was questioned by 2 detectives on 4 separate occasions. Andrew was unable to give a consistent account of the day of the murder and gave a string of unsupported alibis. Nevertheless, he maintained his innocence and readily agreed to give a blood sample, believing that it would be enough to clear him. On June the 10th, Andrew was released from the hospital and taken to court for the charges of impersonating a police officer. Once he was released on bail, he was taken to the police headquarters where he was interviewed yet again, this time for over 9 hours. Even though there was no physical evidence linking him to the scene, and no trace of blood or other evidence from the scene on his person, which would seem unlikely given the violent manner in which Pamela was beaten, Andrew was charged with Pamela's murder. The main evidence against Andrew was firstly a series of notes written by officers during Andrew's interviews. The officers claimed these notes obtained proof of a confession, but they lacked any sort of signature or written acknowledgement from Andrew himself that he had even said or done the things alleged in them. The other piece of evidence was a 20-minute video recording of Andrew at the end of hours of interrogations. In the recording, Andrew gave a theory on how the killer may have committed the crime. Despite giving this hypothetical idea of what may have happened in the third person, the police considered this as a confession. The jury did too. Andrew was convicted in 1995 and sentenced to life in prison. The following year, his appeal to the Supreme Court of Western Australia was dismissed. In 1998, in a desperate attempt to free him, his family reached out to an investigative journalist named Colleen Egan. Colleen brought the case to the attention of a few experts and officials in the justice system. Together, this group of people explored the case and ultimately came to the conclusion that Andrew was innocent. They became something of an exoneration task force from that point forward and uncovered a wealth of information and evidence to support an appeal. This included multiple police reports that, against standard practice, were withheld from the defence team during the murder trial. The case was taken to the Court of Criminal Appeal for a second time in 2003, and armed with their new information, including extensive details of misconduct during the original inquiry, they believed that Andrew would be freed. However, once again the case was dismissed. Andrew's defence team were granted an appeal to the High Court of Australia in October of 2004, and they prepared to plead their case yet again. This appeal finally began in September of 2005. After examining the evidence, Justice Michael Kirby reportedly indicated that one of the documents the police neglected to turn over to the defence was a forensic report showing Andrew's videotape theory of the murder to be physically impossible. This should have been enough to warrant a mistrial on its own. The decision to overturn Andrew's conviction was unanimous. But even after getting his vindication, his freedom was another matter entirely. For an additional 6 months or so, Andrew remained behind bars due to the Department of Public Prosecution's reluctance to drop the charges after the guilty verdict had been overturned. Finally, just as a directions hearing was approaching, they relented and released him on February the 20th, 2006. After a hard-won 12-year battle to clear his name, Andrew Mallard was a free man. Not everyone was convinced of his innocence, however, and that included Pamela Lawrence's family. He was let go with a warning that, should any evidence happen to surface, he could be prosecuted again. After all, if he didn't kill Pamela Lawrence, who did? Once the charges against Andrew were dropped, the Commissioner of the Police decided to find out. And it was at this time that the palm print of the actual killer on a display counter in the jewellery shop was fully investigated. Back in 1994, at the time of the initial investigation, technology hadn't quite evolved far enough to facilitate a way of identifying unknown partial prints. Years later, it would be a significant piece of the puzzle. For one thing, the shop's policy required that staff wipe down that particular display case after each customer left, meaning whoever left the print was likely to be their suspect. For another, over a decade of advancements in forensic science yielded great returns when they ran another search. This time they got a match and a name: Simon Rochford. Once they knew where to look, it didn't take the investigators very long to find him. Simon, as it turned out, was already behind bars. 7 weeks after the murder of Pamela Lawrence, Simon confessed to the murder of his girlfriend, Brigitte Dickens. Both women appear to have been bludgeoned by the same blunt object, a steel collar meant for use by weightlifters to keep their weights secured. Simon attached this collar, which was painted blue, to the handle of a broom and used it like a club. Upon further inspection of Pamela's autopsy report, it was discovered that the coroner found flecks of blue paint embedded in her wounds, and that the shape of the injuries was consistent with those suffered by Brigitte Dickens. When a bag that belonged to Simon was tested, they found more blue paint flecks, identical to the ones noted in the autopsy. To add an extra layer of certainty, it turned out that Simon more closely resembled the description of the man the shop worker's daughter had glimpsed standing behind the counter at the time of the murder. They finally had the true killer, but a trial would never take place. In the month of May 2006, it was an eventful era in the case of Pamela Lawrence's murder. On the 12th of that month, 5 police officers were let go in light of their conduct during the original trial. 1 week later, on the 19th, Simon Rochford was named a person of significant interest in the case. Mere hours after hearing this news, Simon took his own life, and an officer found him dead in his cell. In October of that same year, the investigation finally came to a close with the Commissioner's announcement that review of the case showed that Andrew Mallard was no longer considered a person of interest. Furthermore, he said there was ample evidence to charge Simon Rochford with the death of Pamela Lawrence. The authorities would have sought his conviction had he still been alive. In this announcement, he also apologised to Andrew for the role that the police had played in putting him in prison. Naturally, compensation was in order for the wrongly accused man. Whilst he received $200,000 Australian dollars in 2006 as a partial payment, the State's Attorney General decided that further restitution would be decided once the Commission on Crime and Corruption had fully investigated the officers involved in presenting misleading evidence against him in the trial. The Commission began its public hearings on July 31st, 2007. This was to address the unethical and borderline illegal actions of the officers and prosecutors in charge of the initial investigation and subsequent imprisonment of Andrew Mallard. Just over a year later, on the 7th of October 2008, the Commission on Crime and Corruption recommended that 2 assistant police commissioners and the Deputy Director of Public Prosecution be officially reprimanded. The 2 officers resigned in the wake of the report, and disciplinary proceedings could then go no further against them. In May of 2009, Andrew was finally awarded a $3.25 million Australian dollars settlement. This is about the equivalent of 2.4 million American dollars.
It's going to be the best Christmas I and my family have ever had for a long time. This is fantastic.
After his release, Andrew earned a degree in fine art, and then he moved to London in 2010 to continue his education. He frequently travelled to Los Angeles to visit his fiancée, and it seemed that his ordeal was finally over. However, his life was cut short when on April 18th, 2019, he died after being the victim of a hit and run on Sunset Boulevard in Hollywood.
The silver sedan never once slowing. His final moments captured on security cameras.
Right, sorry. No worries. I'm a bit upset.
The 56-year-old, who'd spent the past 13 years of freedom rebuilding his life, was in Los Angeles visiting his fiancée.
He really just wanted to find a family and to settle down and to find someone to love and have that happy ever after, I suppose.
Former journalist Colleen Egan was instrumental in proving Mallard's innocence, part of an investigative team led by the now Attorney General John Quigley.
We thought that we may never prove his innocence, and we always worried that he would die in jail, and that prison would be the place that he would end.
Andrew Mallard suffered post-traumatic stress disorder from his time in the maximum security Casuarina prison. He was awarded more than $3 million in compensation from the state, but his advocates say he never truly recovered.
His mum and his sister stuck by him all the way through, and really for them to now have to deal with this is very cruel for them.
Now they face another battle to bring his body home to Perth.
It's bittersweet that maybe he was feeling some happiness at the time that he was taken.
Jacqueline Robson, 9 News.
A 19-year-old man was later charged with felony hit and run after turning himself into the police. Andrew was just 57 years old when he died. He had spent a fifth of his life in prison for a crime that he did not commit. As some extra information, a documentary titled Saving Andrew Mallard was directed by Michael Muntz and produced by Artemis International. It first aired on ABC television on the 4th of May 2006. The film focused on Mallard's family and its struggle to have him freed. It also uncovered the deception by the original police investigation team. It was shortlisted for a Walkley Award, and Muntz won the Outstanding Achievement in Directing Award. The documentary also noted at the end that the DPP still considered Mallard a prime suspect in its investigation at that time. That concludes today's case on Andrew Mallard. Please add any comments down below. Thanks very much for listening to The Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye.